Introduction: a passenger who shouldn't have been there. It was a night like any other at Tokyo International Airport. The hum of travelers, the sharp announcements over the intercom, the soft shuffle of footsteps on polished floors. Nothing out of the ordinary, until he stepped off the plane. A man in a sharp suit, his briefcase in hand, walked toward immigration with the calm confidence of someone who had done it 1,000 times. But when he presented his passport, the officer froze. The man's passport, stamped with entries from countries all over the world, should have been routine. But it wasn't. The place of origin was Taured, a country that did not exist. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Taured? It was nowhere on any map. The man was calm, almost too calm. He insisted with growing frustration that Taured had been around for over 1,000 years. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the man vanished. No trace, no record, no explanation. What happened to him? The mystery would remain unsolved, but the questions would never fade. Because some truths are too strange to stay buried, some stories refuse to be forgotten, and this one, this impossible man, was just beginning to unravel. A ghost in the airport. The rain drummed softly against the glass windows of Tokyo International Airport. Outside, the city shimmered under neon lights, its streets slick with the remnants of a passing storm. Inside, the air was thick with the murmur of travelers, the shuffle of feet on polished floors, the occasional crackle of a loudspeaker announcing flights to places that existed on every map. Then, something changed. It was just another evening, just another line of weary passengers waiting to have their passports stamped. The immigration officer, a man who had seen thousands of documents pass through his hands, barely glanced at the next traveler in line until he saw the passport. His routine expression shifted, his brow furrowing as his fingers traced the embossed lettering. Taured. A pause, a glance at the traveler. The man was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his polished shoes reflecting the dull airport lighting. He appeared European, his hair neatly combed, his expression calm, perhaps too calm. "Where are you coming from?" the officer asked, keeping his voice neutral. "From Taured," the man replied, his tone laced with quiet confidence. He had answered this question countless times before. The officer hesitated. He had worked this post for years. He knew every country, every territory, every unrecognized state. But Taured did not exist. "Where is Taured?" he asked, flipping through the passport. The man's expression shifted slightly. Annoyance? Confusion? He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if trying to contain his irritation. "Taured has existed for over 1,000 years," he said. "It lies between France and Spain." The officer's stomach tightened. He knew that land well. That region belonged to Andorra. He motioned for a colleague. Soon, airport security was involved. The man watched them calmly, as if this was not the first time something like this had happened. His documents were real. The passport, the visas, even the currency in his wallet. Everything was authentic, yet impossibly wrong. And so, beneath the cold fluorescence of the airport, surrounded by men who could not explain what they were seeing, the man from Taured ceased to be just another traveler. He became a mystery, one that, before the night was over, would only deepen. The impossible passport. The immigration officer turned the passport over in his hands, his fingers tracing the official seals, the crisp pages filled with stamps from France, Spain, Japan, places that undeniably existed. Yet the country of origin, Taured, was nowhere on any map. A supervisor was called, then another. The small group of uniformed men whispered among themselves in hushed Japanese, glancing at the well-dressed traveler who stood before them, patient but clearly growing irritated. "Sir," one of them finally said, "can you show us on a map where Taured is located?" The man sighed as if this were an absurd request. With a practiced motion, he pulled a map from his briefcase and unfolded it across the counter. His finger landed confidently on the small nation wedged between France and Spain. The officers exchanged uneasy looks. "That is Andorra," one of them said carefully. The traveler frowned, his gaze flickering between the officers and the map. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Andorra? I have never heard of it. That land is Taured. It has been for over 1,000 years." For the first time, uncertainty flashed across his face. One of the officers excused himself, stepping away to make a phone call. Meanwhile, another continued flipping through the passport. Everything else was legitimate. The texture of the paper, the holographic security features, even the ink, it all matched Japanese records, except for the fact that Taured did not exist. "Sir, what is the purpose of your visit?" "Business," the man said, regaining his composure. He reached into his briefcase and produced a set of documents: contracts, official letters, business proposals. He handed them over with steady hands. The officer examined them. The company names were real. He had heard of them before. Yet when they called the companies to verify, the responses were always the same. "We have no record of this man. We have never conducted business with anyone from Taured." The traveler's polite patience began to fray. His voice grew sharper. "This is ridiculous. I have been to Japan multiple times. Check your records." They did. There was no record of his previous entries. No record of Taured. No record of him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The man from Taured, so confident only minutes ago, now seemed like something else entirely. A ghost pressing against the edges of reality, trying to force himself into existence. For the first time that night, he looked uneasy, and so did the officers. The man who shouldn't exist. The air in the small interrogation room was thick with unease. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across the table where the impossible man sat. His polished shoes tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm against the floor, the only sound in the tense silence. On the other side of the table, two officers exchanged glances. The senior officer cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we have contacted the companies listed in your documents. They do not recognize your name. They claim to have never done business with you." The traveler's brow furrowed. "That's impossible," he said. "I've worked with them for years." The younger officer hesitated before sliding a second document across the table. A list of international countries recognized by Japan. "Taured is not on this list," he said. "As far as our records show, your country does not exist." A flicker of something passed across the man's face. Confusion? Fear? It was the first crack in his otherwise unshakable composure. He studied the list for several seconds, his fingers tightening around the paper as if willing the words to change. Then his expression shifted again, calm, unreadable. He set the paper down, smoothing out the creases with careful precision. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice steady. "I have been to Japan before. I have stamps in my passport. I have stayed in hotels here." The senior officer folded his arms. "And yet," he said slowly, "we have no record of your previous visits." Silence. The traveler sat motionless. For the first time since the interrogation began, he looked lost. The officers did not know what to do. This was not a case of forged documents, not an issue of mistaken identity. The man's passport was real as theirs. His travel history had been stamped and approved, yet those records had seemingly vanished, or had they never existed in the first place? A chill settled over the room. There was something deeply unsettling about the emptiness behind this man. An absence of a past, an absence of a place. As if he had stepped out of somewhere else, somewhere that had never been recorded, never been mapped, somewhere that should not exist. The senior officer exhaled and pushed his chair back. "We will need to hold you overnight while we investigate further." The traveler opened his mouth as if to protest, then stopped. His expression was unreadable once more. He simply nodded. The officers led him out of the room, through the long, sterile corridors of the airport, past indifferent travelers and uniformed personnel who would never know that they had just walked past a man who defied reality itself. By the time morning came, he would be gone. The vanishing. The room was small, sterile, and featureless. Just a bed, a table, and a single window overlooking the city lights of Tokyo. The man from Taured sat on the edge of the mattress, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His expression was unreadable. Outside, two guards stood watch. The door was locked from the outside. There was no way out. The senior immigration officer, now exhausted from the night's bizarre events, ran a hand through his hair. He had ordered every security measure possible, a guard at the door, another stationed at the end of the hallway, and regular check-ins every hour. This man would not slip through their fingers, and yet an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. Sometime before dawn, the city outside was restless, humming with life. Inside the hotel, the hallway remained still, save for the quiet shuffling of the guards changing shifts. The officer checked his watch. 3 a.m. Routine. Another check. The guards approached the door and knocked. No response. Another knock. Silence. Frowning, one of them pulled out a key and unlocked the door. The handle turned with a soft click. The door swung open, revealing an empty room. The bed was untouched, the sheets still crisp. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The window was locked from the inside. The vents were too small for escape. The door had been watched the entire night, and yet he was gone. The officers searched the hotel, then the airport, then the surrounding city. They scanned surveillance footage, desperate to find something. A clue, a shadow, anything. Nothing. It was as if the man had never existed. Aftermath, an impossible silence. By sunrise, the case had already begun to disappear. There was no paperwork on the man's arrest. His passport, his briefcase, his business documents, all gone. The officers who had interrogated him could not explain what had happened without sounding insane. And so, the records were buried. The incident never officially happened. Yet among the few who had witnessed it, the memory remained. The unsettling knowledge that, for one brief moment, they had encountered someone, or something, that did not belong. Had he slipped between realities? Had he simply ceased to exist? Or had he never been here at all? Theories and haunting questions. Long after the man from Taured vanished, his presence lingered like a shadow in the minds of those who had seen him. The officers, the airport staff, the investigators, they never spoke of it publicly, but they never forgot. Behind closed doors, theories were whispered. The spy theory, some believed he had been a spy, an agent operating under a flawless cover until something went wrong. But if he were a spy, where had he gone? How had he escaped a locked room under constant watch? And why did every piece of his identity vanish along with him? The parallel universe hypothesis. Others entertained a more disturbing idea. The man had not simply disappeared. He had returned to wherever he had come from. What if by some impossible means, he had slipped through a crack between realities? What if in his world, Taured was real and Andorra had never existed? And what if, for a brief moment, he had fallen into the wrong version of reality? The temporal displacement theory. Some even suggested he was a traveler out of time, a man who had unknowingly stepped forward or backward into a world where his home had never existed. If so, was he the only one? A lingering mystery. Years passed, the story faded into obscurity, buried beneath other unexplained events, other mysteries that refused to be solved. Yet from time to time, travelers, customs officers, and border agents whispered of others. A man whose hometown no one could find, a traveler with a passport from a country that did not exist, a person who seemed utterly normal, except for the fact that they should not be there at all. And so the question remained, was the man from Taured simply an elaborate myth? Or was he proof that just beyond the veil of what we understand, reality is far more fragile than we ever imagined? Conclusion: a lingering mystery. The story of the man from Taured should have been forgotten. After all, what is a single disappearance in a world full of chaos and fleeting moments? What is one strange incident in the vast expanse of history? But some mysteries refuse to die. The man's name, his passport, his presence, all erased. Yet there was something about his disappearance that gnawed at the minds of those who witnessed it. An uneasy feeling, an unsettled knowledge that what they had seen was not easily explained. The travelers who had passed through the airport that day never learned of the man's absence. The authorities buried the case as if it had never happened. There were no newspaper headlines, no reports, no investigations. The man was gone, and the world moved on. But for those few who had been involved, who had looked into his eyes and seen his world disappear, there was no closure. It was as if he had never existed in the first place. Could he return? In the years that followed, rumors spread. People in the shadows, those who believed in things that defied logic, wondered, could the man from Taured ever return? Perhaps in some distant future or parallel world, he might cross the threshold of time and space once more. Maybe one day he would step through the door and walk into our world again. But what would happen if he did? Would he still be the same man? Would he be just as bewildered, just as out of place? Or would he remember his home, his country, his reality, and finally realize where he truly belonged? The unanswered question. There is one thing that remains certain about the man from Taured. He left behind a question that cannot be answered. What happens when a person is caught between worlds, between realities that refuse to align? What does it mean when someone from a place that should not exist stands before us? Real, tangible, but impossible? In the end, perhaps we are all like him, just travelers in an ever-shifting world, unaware of the borders between dimensions, between times, between places we will never understand. And perhaps that is the most unsettling mystery of all, that the answers we seek may never come.